Hello, everyone. Like he said, I'm Katie Phillips. I'm a consultant at Elaborate, which is primarily an agile management consultancy. We also have a product area, and I'm in that area as the research specialist. So like Rick said, my background is in anthropology, and I guess that sort of led me to start looking at big data analysis, because a lot of times when I started with a project or a product, what I wanted to do first was find out what was already known. And what I found out really quickly is that there's quite a lot already known usually. But it exists in little pockets around companies, and it doesn't necessarily exist in the same location across the company. So I'll tell you a little bit about what big data analysis is, what big data is, I suppose, where you might find some sources for this type of data at your company, how to make sense of what you find. So talk a little bit about analyzing, methods for analyzing, and then also how to form actionable insights based on what you find. So what is thick data? You might also hear it called rich data, I suppose. It's basically a mix of qualitative and quantitative information. The goal behind it is to provide some context for the information that you have available. And really, the core purpose of that is to give you the why behind some of the numbers that you might have, or the numbers behind some of the whys that you have. So really trying to make sense of things from a variety of perspectives. One of the best parts about analyzing data this way is that it makes the data actionable. So it gives you a lot more to work with when you're trying to optimize things and create efficiencies than potentially just one or two bits of information. So this is just a primer. I'm sure you guys all know the differences between qualitative and quantitative data, but I'll just do like a high-level recap. So quantitative data, the assumption that quantitative data usually works under is that there's a fixed and measurable reality, whereas qualitative depends a little bit more on dynamic negotiated realities and things that change regularly. So neither one of those perspectives is right or wrong. They're just both things to look at when you're looking at different types of data. With quantitative data, it's primarily collected through just measuring things, whereas qualitative data is usually collected through like interviews, open text responses, observations, so things that aren't necessarily as measurable. Quantitative data analyzed by numerical comparisons, no surprise, whereas qualitative data is typically understood in terms of behaviors, thoughts, responses, causal analysis, and things like that. Another important thing is that qualitative data is usually reported in the language of the customers or of the studied group, whereas quantitative data, especially in a business context, is usually reported in the language of the business. And it just, they're just different ways of qualifying information, I suppose. So we'll talk a little bit about a cup of coffee. This is a flat white, just to understand a little bit about quant versus qual. Quantitative data would potentially explain a flat white being 130 mils of of milk, 30 mils of espresso. 80% of all of our orders are flat whites. We serve it at 80 degrees Celsius, and our profit margin is 71%. So as you can see, very measurable, quantifiable information. A qualitative analysis of this would give you the title of it, obviously. Say it's a mix of espresso and hot milk. It's got a velvety sort of consistency, so not potentially something that's quantifiable. Some of our customers prefer having it in a bigger mug than a smaller mug. And our customer happiness increases when there's some decorative foam work on top. So knowledge of the beverage is increasing globally. We found this through an analysis of different, say, social media trends, for instance. And customers are typically taking longer to drink. So as you can see, like neither is better or worse, and they live better together. especially when you're trying to make decisions and actions based on what you know already about something. So I'll tell you a story. This story is about a client of mine who basically was measuring regularly their employee engagement. So they were using a method for surveying their employees and trying to uplift engagement off of that. And I'm sure this is something that all of you are familiar with, hopefully these days. Anyway, what happened was one of the key measures for enablement in the survey was whether the statement was find your place of work comfortable to work in, or enjoy your workplace, something along those lines. Can't remember exactly. But what did this mean? So they got a score off the back of this, a score that said 67% of our employees are happy with their workplace. But this particular client, for context, their employees weren't always working in the head office. They were out on site, they were on the road, they weren't in the head office. So what did this mean? Why was this question in the survey, I suppose, to begin with? Who knows, but it was there. And what do you do with that information, knowing the context of this company? So what we did was put that information, which is, a very small bit of data, put that information against things like a Trello board saying where all of the employees were working at any given time. Engagement data showing where the employees were when they were on site and how long they had been there. Also looking at stuff like the open text responses to the surveys and just triangulating all of that information against each other to find out why this result was what it was. What we found is that of the staff who were working in the head office, 90% of them were happy with their workspace. So that tells us something completely different, right? Also, those people who were giving the lowest scores had generally been on a client site for a very long time. They basically had said in the open text responses that they were often in like project rooms, which were lightless, sort of stuffy, less interaction with fellow colleagues at the company, and less interaction also with the employees who worked for the company where they were. So what do you do with that information? What do you do with a small bit of data versus a lot of data? So you take action. You try to take the best action that you possibly can, given what you have to work with. When you only have a little bit of data, you end up making incorrect decisions a lot of the time because all you have to work on is assumptions. So you're taking a little bit of information and you're trying to make sense of it without accurate evidence to help you make your decision. So an action that would come off of the back of the survey that said 67% of the staff are happy at their place of business would be to uplift the workspaces. That's what we have control over. We can put some budget towards that. We're going to uplift the workspaces. Unfortunately, as you can see, that doesn't solve the root cause of the problem, right? Because the root cause of the problem is actually the client site. It's not the head office. So actions based on that information are things like encourage the offsite staff to visit the head offices more often, require sign-off, so a little bit more control over the workspace when you're on a client site. Encouraging offsite staff to come back to the head offices and engage in activities, social clubs, things like that. And this is where you really start to see that the actions that you're generating, the decisions that you're making are addressing those root cause issues. And rather than just sort of making your best guess, you can actually start to make some good decisions. So where do I look? This is kind of the best part for me. I love doing this. You sort of are a little bit of a detective. So the first thing to do always with anything is to choose your objective and your area of focus. So how broad are you trying to go? Are you trying to look at a specific product? Are you trying to look at a specific customer set? Are you looking internally or externally? Figure out where you're looking first and what your objective is. Because you'll find that there's a lot of information already at your companies or at your clients. And it can be overwhelming if you don't have a focus. Then find your sources. So knowing what you know about your objective, you can start to look for some sources. So these are some common data types. I have broken them up. You might not, this crew might not be interested as much in the employee-focused side, might be more on the customer-focused side. I've broken them up into partially fully analyzed data and unanalyzed and raw data. And the reason for that is because there's always a preference for raw data when you're doing this type of analysis. It's really hard to look at already analyzed data if you're trying to triangulate information. So stuff that you might look at for customer-focused, surveys, whoop, why do I keep doing that? Surveys with open text fields. So this is NPS surveys, feedback forms, market research surveys, anything along those lines. Existing research, so if somebody in your company has done interviews before, customer interviews or user testing before, grab some information from that. Annual reports are always good. They house a lot of information that's been carefully curated, but like I said, it's that stuff is usually pre-analyzed, so just be a little bit wary. The unanalyzed stuff is really good here, and there's a lot of it. So support tickets are incredibly helpful. So if you start looking at how many customers have called about a particular issue, you can start to really identify some of the major and consistent pain points for customers. Customer Contact Center holds a lot of information. So you'll find that if you start digging into, if you have an existing product, for instance, and you start digging into a Customer Contact Center data, they'll have verbatim quotes from people. They will have potentially audio or video that you can access. Sometimes they'll make spreadsheets with lists of issues that customers are calling in with to help them make sense of their work. And that's some of the stuff that you can find. Online review sites, open source, be wary with anything that's online review because they always skew negative, always. So don't always take those with a grain of salt. You definitely don't want to be looking at those as your main source of information because then immediately you just go, everybody hates us. Everybody hates us. Website and app analytics, any sort of Omniture dashboards that people have set up around the place. If you're looking at a legacy product, you can look at their data from that. Sales data, geographic and demographic info, and social media. So I'm not going to talk about the employee-focused one. The thing to remember with any of this, but particularly with employee-focused stuff, is that there's an ethical requirement here. So as soon as you get information, the more information that you get, the more careful you have to be about what you do with that information. I've got lots of resources on ethics in research. I'm happy to share them afterwards. It's kind of its own talk, so I won't dig into it a lot here. But what I will say is when you're gathering data of this magnitude, I suppose, be careful what you do about it. Be careful who you talk to about it. Sometimes things can be not anonymized enough. So it'll have customer information on it. It'll have names, times, things like that. If you're going to share any of that with anybody, just the key thing to remember is to anonymize as much as you possibly can. So try and take out all identifying factors before you share any of that stuff with anybody. Right, so how are we for time, right? Okay? Oh, good, okay. So you've got it, now what? So it can get quite daunting at this stage. You've gone really wide in your information gathering. Where do you go from there? It can really get kind of overwhelming. So baby steps. Sometimes I actually take a break at this stage and just take a little rest and let my brain recharge. Set aside some time, just briefly review it. You don't have to put it all in the same format, but I prefer to because it helps eliminate bias. So what I mean by bias is, well, there are tons of biases, but in putting everything in the same format, what you're looking to eliminate is that you have preference for one source of information over another. So you just try and mitigate that. The other biases that are really common when you're doing this type of analysis, especially if you're working for the company where the information was gathered for, is confirmation bias is just a massive one. So you already have made a decision for yourself and you're looking for information that supports that decision. Be really wary. The only thing to do with biases are just like to make sure that you know that they're there, right? So it's basically just acknowledging it and being careful of using it when you're doing your analysis. Confirmation bias, curse of knowledge is also a really big one in this type of scenario, which is, it basically means like you know a lot of the reasons behind a lot of things, or you've been party to conversations that maybe lead you to think in one way or another. So you've got an excess of knowledge and you start trying to make sense based on those factors. So that's another one to be aware of. And then start analysis. So affinity mapping. Can I get a show of hands who's done this before? Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Yeah, a bit? Cool. It's probably the most common type of analysis that you'll see for this breadth of data. There are many ways to do an analysis. This just happens to be my favorite one. I find that it gets better outputs. Basically what it is, and you know, only a few of you raised your hands, but you guys are gonna know what I'm talking about in a minute. If you've ever done a retro or a workshop or anything like that, and you're asked to put little notes on Post-its, and then you stand up and put them in theme groups together, that's affinity mapping. So it's nothing too crazy. It's basically using the information, putting them in bite-sized chunks, and then moving them around to where they most make sense with each other. That's basically it. So it's not rocket science at this stage, it's just time and effort, because you'll end up with a lot of information. You reassess as you are looking at the patterns, and you just rinse and repeat. My main cautionary tale with this one is don't start forming your themes too early. That's something that you can do, especially if there's some confirmation bias. So wait until like about halfway through to start really nailing themes from this information. Also don't report too early, because the same thing, people love research and they love anything that's gonna help them make a decision. So I guess the concern there is that if you report too early, people get really excited and they start making decisions based on an incomplete analysis. So don't report too early, don't theme too early. But yeah, other than that, just keep on going, keep on trucking. It takes time. Beware, it's gonna take time. It can get monotonous, but that's okay, because about halfway through, you'll start making connections and then it gets really exciting. So once you start making connections and you can start to see how the data fits with each other, then you can see your work starting to pay off. So what do I pay attention to? So there's kind of like a hierarchy of things to pay attention to when you're looking at a piece of data. There's more than this, of course. Relevancy to objective or area of focus, number one. Don't start pulling things out because they're not relevant until a little while in, just like with themes, because it might be relevant and you're not quite sure yet. Wait until like sort of midway through to start doing that. Content, obviously. How and why it was generated. So who commissioned it? How long ago was it? Was it done internally or was it an external vendor? That type of thing. Causal relationships. So how are these bits tied together? And that is sort of the whole project as well. Evaluative attitude of message to speaker. So this is like if it's my direct words and it's in an open text format or it's an audio recording or something like that, how do I feel about what I'm saying? Am I being really emotive about it? Because that indicates to me, if somebody's being really emotive about something, that that's incredibly important to them. Obviously, some people are more emotive than others, keep that in mind. But yeah, you wanna have a perspective of how people feel when they're saying those things. Individual over group ideas, and same actual over hypothetical experience. So something that says, I didn't get my annual review this year is a lot different than something that says, I'm really worried that our annual review process isn't going to be great next year. So you want to make sure that you're looking at actual experience, not imagined experience or hypothetical, and also me versus we think that something is happening, because people can attribute lots of things to a lot of people who don't necessarily mean that. And repetition, and I'll get into themes. So these are just type of patterns that you're looking for. So trends are stuff that change over time. So this is really helpful if you've got like longitudinal data. So stuff that has happened over the past year. You're looking at what has changed and when. Repetition, stuff that repeats itself. That gives you an idea of how relevant something is just through prevalence, because it just keeps repeating itself. Cycles, regularly recurring. So this is more around like potentially if you have something that you know occurs every year. So for instance, if you let's say you run an accounting software platform, and every year you notice that your active users spike in May. Well, you know they're going to always spike in May because that's just before tax time. So that's stuff like that you can see has a reason and is recurring. Clusters, stuff in a small area. And gaps are really important. Gaps tell you when there's no data somewhere, it always makes me curious why there's no data somewhere. Are we not tracking it appropriately? Is it something that our customers don't care about at all? Our customers care about a lot, but nobody has addressed it yet, and so it's a potential opportunity for us. So look at those as well. Write up insights and recommendations and share. Share it as much as you can with all of your teams who have something to do with the decisions that you're making. People like to know that the decisions that are being made are based on evidence. So if you can provide that evidence to the people who are surrounding you, they'll be much more likely to support your decisions. Things to include in analysis. So you put like it's important to put the taxonomy of themes. So the top theme, I'll put it in an example of the story that I told you before. So the theme would be location. Location is what the data is about. Summary is just a synopsis. So a summary of that would be our information tells us conflicting information about whether or not our employees like working at their physical workspace. The insight is what the data actually says. So we actually found that the people who disliked working at their workplace disliked it because they had been on client site for a very long time. Employees who worked in the office were quite happy with their environment. Recommendations, so that's where it starts to get fun. That's about actions, and you can be creative. If you're not creative, take it to the team, take it to your coworkers, say this is the kind of thing that we found. What do you guys reckon? How should we address this? This is what we found is going on. You can do just a bit of ideation or workshop or anything along those lines. If you're creative, do it yourself. Check it with everybody else, see if they have other inputs. Actions are things like I shared before, like increase social events at the head office, for instance. And then test. So this is really important. You want to test what your hypotheses are out the back of these. So if you're putting together a recommendation that says if you put together an action or recommendation that says the majority of our consultants who have been on long-term engagements are unhappy with their workplace, what we need to do is make sure that there's client sign-off and that there's employee sign-off every time they go somewhere new. You can test that. So you make a measure around what it means if that's successful. You say, we're going to do another employee engagement survey in a year. What we'll expect to happen off the back of this is that engagement or enablement score will go up 5%. Yes, you can attribute that to multiple things. Keep it in mind. But it's important to know how you'll measure what you're doing and what you're recommending. And that's it. Thank you. Questions?